Welcome to The Difference Makers, a Paladin security podcast. We'll take you inside the world of security and share firsthand expertise from our industry professionals. Join us as we dive into everything security and explore the journeys of those who go above and beyond to make our world a safer and friendlier place.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Difference Makers podcast. We have a special episode for you today about community engagement. Paladin Director James Blight recently sat down with Connie Marciniuk, a community safety liaison from the city of Edmonton, in a webinar format with a live audience to discuss the topic and how empathy-led security plays a factor. The conversation was so good, we just had to share it. Enjoy this encore presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Really excited to have everybody in the meeting. We're excited today to talk about basically community engagement and empathy-led security. So I want to give a quick introduction to our guest speaker today. You can see on the screen with me. Connie Marciniuk is a community safety liaison officer, or community safety liaison with the city of Edmonton. He's been in this position with the city of Edmonton for about 16 years and is assigned specifically to the downtown district. And she gave me her bio, which is in the invite. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's one line I like, which is Connie has always been interested in positively contributing to the well-being of individuals and communities. And I think that's something you're going to hear as a theme in today's talk. Just that interest in positively contributing. And hopefully we can hit on we're coming at this topic from the perspective of the security professionals and property managers, and then talking about how we can as security officers positively impact people's experience, even on a day-to-day basis or even on a longer term. And I've got a story I'll share with the group when we get further into this. So yeah, I don't want to go on and on with all of Connie's accolades. I will say that she also enjoys outdoor activity. Living in Edmonton, she likes the cold weather, so cross-country skiing, snowboarding, and escaping to the mountains as often as she can to hike and bike and enjoy nature, which is something that most of us in Canada, I think, can appreciate. So
I've learned to accept the cold weather, not like the cold weather.
Fair. Well, living in Edmonton, I think you have to. You either do or you don't. So today's topic is community engagement and empathy-led security, and we're specifically going to sort of center around empathy-led engagement with the unhoused, the drug addicted, marginalized people with mental health challenges, etc. And I think this is a pertinent topic for every city in Canada. I think we've probably seen an increase in homelessness across the country. But Connie, can you give us an idea of what that looks like or how it's changed in Edmonton specifically? Because I think that's probably indicative of the country.
Yeah, I will in just a second, but if it's okay, I just want to backtrack just for one quick sec, just to preface kind of the experience that I've had. And I have been in this role for about 16 years, but to give people a bit of an understanding that I do have a degree of appreciation and understanding for where you folks are coming from, is that the program that I work in, it's a partnership between the city and the police. And then we work with a youth service as well. But all of the work that we do is driven around how we can increase either perceptions or realities of safety for our citizens. That looks very different depending upon where we are in the city. We do kind of different projects and stuff. But at one point, and especially sort of like early in my career with the city, I was like based in one community with a police officer in and out of a police car sort of on a daily basis, and really trying to be that one-stop shop for increasing safety, not in an intervention kind of way, as opposed to a community development kind of way. And now I've worked downtown, and I'd worked downtown previously, but I've worked in our downtown core for about 4 years at this point. And so like I've seen the progression of what a downtown core looks like. And I've also known that like you don't put a community safety program in the communities that are viewed as particularly safe and that are not crime and disorder issues. So I understand to the degree that I can and empathize with the experiences that some of you folks are having out there. So just wanting to preface that just a little bit, because sometimes city employees aren't necessarily always seen as on the ground individuals. So I can appreciate that. So
right on. No, I appreciate that.
In terms of some of like our unhoused folks, like in Edmonton, and James, I think you're right. It's kind of been a nationwide-ish experience. But in Edmonton in particular, we've had almost an 80% increase in our unhoused folks. And that doesn't necessarily mean that folks that are only living in the streets, only living in encampments or visiting shelters. They could also be just like couch surfing, that type of thing. But we know that like increases the degree of vulnerability that they have. And that's been about an 80% over the course of the past 4 years. So it wasn't from last year to this year, but it's kind of been a slow progression upwards, pardon me, which is like absolutely unfortunate that it's part of the experience that we're just having as a city in general. And again, I'm imagining that you have something roughly similar kind of across the board with any major municipality, frankly. I am always really cautious to sort of in our current context that not only do we have like an increase in our unhoused folks, it's that we're also seeing an increase in the complexity of those folks too. So they're becoming harder to house, more entrenched in community and in a way of life. The degree of unmanaged or unwell managed or unsuccessfully managed mental health has increased in the population. Give or take, everybody is carrying weapons out there. And I say give or take just to like not blanket statement it. Yet I'm pretty confident that the vast majority are. But also we do know, like statistically speaking, there are most likely to be victimized population as well. So I think that's also like a really important factor to kind of bring into the conversation too, when we are talking about dealing with unhoused folks. So,
so just to touch on that topic. So just so I'm understanding you, if I caught what you said correctly, it would be generally a good idea to assume that an unhoused person is probably carrying something to defend themselves with. And the reason for that is not because they're necessarily wanting to be aggressive or wanting to be violent against people, but because they feel the need to defend themselves because they're victimized by perhaps other people on the street or anyone else that might engage with them.
Absolutely.
That's an interesting thing to think about.
Not for the sake of necessarily being aggressive. It's more of a defensive kind of mechanism.
Okay.
And also in that, really important to recognize that we do have folks that are on the street that may like either appear unhoused or precariously housed or maybe marginalized in one sense or the other that are completely not actually unhoused and are more likely to be victimizing our folks than anything else. So those are usually like individuals that are out there and, you know, dealing and trading in drugs and weapons, those types of things.
Okay. That's interesting. So I this might come up later. I don't know. I've heard that in some cases, if someone who's unhoused wants to take advantage of, say, a shelter that's available, like a city or government sponsored shelter, in some cases they have to give up their weapons. That is a fact. Does that discourage them from taking advantage of the shelters?
I can't speak on an entire population's behalf, but I would say if I am obligated to release all of the small amount of possessions that I have, or not be with my partner, not be with my pet, not be with all of those things, I'd be far less likely to engage kind of in that shelter system. So,
okay.
Yeah.
No, it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind as we're talking about this group and the challenges they have, because I think part of the purpose of today is to talk about how we can best as security professionals engage with these groups. But I think it's also important for us to understand life from their perspective a little bit, because I think it helps to give us a better framework for engaging and approaching and speaking with them in any kind of way. So that's interesting things. I mean, we're sort of just having a conversation here, so we can totally add more or come back to some of these topics. But one of the things, like our client base in a lot of cases are property managers. And so obviously homelessness impacts those groups in different ways. I mean, in some cases, unhoused people are seeking shelter. So they're finding stairwells and nooks and crannies to shelter in. Sometimes they're coming right into properties that are open to the public to maybe use washrooms or to use the washrooms for other purposes, like to be speaking candidly, some of the unhoused population has struggles with addiction, and they do find opportunities to use washroom environments to consume drugs and experience those drugs. So I guess what's your take on I guess that topic in general?
Like, I think that's like an additional layer of complexity that comes into this, because then we're not just dealing with the consequences of individuals who are unhoused and the consequences on them. There is a larger picture that does need to be reflected on. And I think that is the fact, like you're saying, that we have more unhoused folks. They, not all the time, please do not like think that I'm, again, painting, an entire population with a brush, but could be those that are stealing from stores, engaging in social disorder, making things uncomfortable or unsafe for some people that are in those spaces. So if they're victimizing a store owner, a business, like that doesn't make it feel like a welcoming environment. And that has its own consequences on like people's shrink and on people's like the profit that they are able to make as a result of this. But we know too that we have our unhoused folks that have fewer and fewer and fewer spaces to go to. So just like you're suggesting, like they'll find a stairwell, they'll find some place where they themselves feel safe, at least temporarily. And when they're pushed out from space to space to space, they're trying to find that last one. And when there's fewer and fewer spaces to be, and if our shelter system or our day spaces don't feel particularly safe for them either, it's not going to be a place that they're going to gravitate towards. They're going to gravitate towards those more anonymous spaces. But one of the things that we're seeing sort of in Edmonton here, at least as well, and especially with some of the consequences of opioids that we're seeing and some of those addictions and stuff, is that we're seeing an increased number of individuals who are experiencing poisonings, right? Just kind of across the board, it's something that we're most definitely seeing. And then we're seeing individuals who feel ill-equipped to be dealing with that and who are ill-equipped. And I'm sure like the vast majority of your folks that like are kind of like signed up today and participating in this line of work didn't necessarily sign up to be doing constant reversals, right? So even just like the experience of the trauma that has on people. And like I talked to like shop owners in some of our kind of like outskirt districts, and they're like, I never know if I'm walking up to my shop and there's a dead person on my doorstep. Right. That in of it is ridiculously traumatizing for people. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Worked on that aspect of things as well. So we have a population in and of itself has a heightened victimization, but they are victimizing other people in a whole variety of ways potentially too. So it's like this strange dynamic back and forth that is really, really quite complex. And then I also think like we struggle with our transit system here in Edmonton, and we have a lot of like social media rhetoric that's out there, and people ride the train once or they see one social media post and now that space is unsafe and they will never go on the train again. And I think that's the same kind of experience that can happen for a shop, right? So if you are a downtown or wherever, business operator, and you have a number of unhoused folks that might be around in that space, or people that are making other people feel uncomfortable, then is that customer going to come back again? Potentially not, especially if they themselves as a customer feel ill-equipped or uncomfortable in that. Now they've painted your store with that same brush. So most definitely can understand like the economic even impacts of this for those that are operating too.
It makes sense. It makes sense. You used a word in there that perhaps most of our audience is familiar with, but I just want to touch on it. Connie mentioned potentially security, frontline employees being uncomfortable doing reversals. A reversal is when you apply naloxone or Narcan to someone who's overdosing and in need of intervention. And that reversal process can be it can be quite an experience. Typically, when someone comes out of an overdose state because of the application of Narcan or naloxone, they're occasionally agitated, angry, perhaps that their high has been ruined, because often they didn't realize they were on the cusp of death. So we might think, as someone intervening in this situation, that, oh, I just saved your life. You're probably grateful. The initial reaction from that person who's experiencing that might not be that they may not be as appreciative as we might think they would be, because of, from their perspective, they didn't know they were going to die. They were experiencing a euphoric state, a state of being high on whatever their drug is. And then being pulled out of it. Essentially, you're pulled out of it almost instantly, which can be very angering to someone who has had to work hard or take a lot of time to collect the money they need to purchase the drugs through theft or through panhandling or any other way that they're getting their money. So just so we're all on the same page, what a reversal is that Connie was mentioning. And that kind of
touching. Sometimes I forget about words.
No, it's okay. It could be the whole audience is totally kept up with us here. I really appreciated what you were saying about that. I think we need to understand as much as we need to be empathetic to the plight of the unhoused population. There is an impact on business owners, and sometimes it's not a huge corporation that we kind of say, well, suck it up. You're a huge corporation. You shouldn't complain. Sometimes it's mom and pop shops that are having challenges staying open because of recurring theft or recurring, like Connie was talking about. You come to the front of the store and there's someone high and unconscious out front of the store. Maybe you don't want to come back, and it can impact their sales, which impacts that person's ability to make a living. So I think that's a valid thing we need to keep in mind. I think what I want to show right now, just on the PowerPoint here, I just want to show you folks something that I found quite interesting. So I want to give credit where it's due. This is from a security colleague, Mike Byrne. He works for Scope Safety and Security. He's actually the owner of Scope Safety and Security, and he's got some amazing training courses. If you have time, I recommend checking this site out. You can see the link there on the slide. This specific course, the basic engaging with the homeless populations course, is free to take. I highly recommend that you take a look at this, Google it, look them up, and try and get registered for this course. Some of you will recognize the image on the screen here, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is how people make decisions in their lives. So we've got this triangle of needs. You've got the wants at the top and the needs at the bottom. So obviously the needs are the most important. And just for the sake of keeping everyone up to speed on this, I know some people if you've taken higher education, you've probably seen this many times. But if you haven't, maybe you've never seen this before. So I just want to talk about it at a high level here. So this image is how Maslow decided that people decide to prioritize and make critical decisions. So starting with the bottom, the most important need for most of us is physiological. It's the essentials, the biological needs: air to breathe, drink, food, shelter, clothing, warmth, sleep, etc. These are the basics of keeping our bodies alive. And as we go up the hierarchy, we get to safety. The second one for most of us is control, essentially, but having a steady income or steady money available to us, access to police and schools, access to medical care, access to or having financial security, and the safety piece, freedom from fear. In general, most of us live free of fear for the most part. Obviously, we've got little fears and little things that bug us from time to time, but in general, we're not afraid for our lives on a day-to-day basis in most cases. The next one is love and belonging. So interpersonal relationships, friendships, intimacy, trust, acceptance. Those are important pieces of our existence as human beings. And then the next one from that is esteem. That's like your self-respect, your dignity and your achievements, things you feel proud of. And then the last one is self-actualization. And that's essentially the potential for us to achieve our fullest potential. So a person who is housed and in general, I don't want to say normal person, that doesn't seem right, but just in general, people, this is the hierarchy of our needs. And if we don't have the bottom ones, we can't have the top ones. If I don't have enough food, I will never be able to achieve my fullest potential. If I am always stressed about finances, I will never probably be able to have a really good intimacy, trust relationship, because I need those bottom pieces of the pyramid in order to have the top. And what I found really interesting from Mike Byrne's course is this next slide. Mike is incredibly experienced with this. I think he worked in Calgary and had a lot of interactions with the homeless population in Calgary. But this next slide, this is how unhoused people make decisions per Mike's experience and the course that he has out, which again, and you'll notice that there's some things that are out of order. If I go back to the first one here, the very basic need for most of us is physiological. It's our food and shelter and clothing and warmth. And if we flip to where we see the unhoused folks, you can see physiological stuff is further up the pyramid. We've got some other things happening in the needs level, or the bottom of the pyramid. So I want to talk a little bit about this image and how I think it applies to the unhoused. But essentially, the bottom of the pyramid is esteem, and that's fundamental for individuals living on the streets who have nothing but themselves. How they see themselves is a huge part and important to their day-to-day. Some of them might be funny, some of them might be physically dominant, some of them might be helpful to people, and that sort of defines who they are. And it becomes really important to their existence and what they choose to do. And I want to talk at the end of this slide about a couple of things, and then get Connie's input on it as well. The second one from the bottom is love and belonging. The presence of friends, non-judgmental friendships. That's important to people who are struggling with addiction and unhoused. The last thing they want is a friend who criticizes them for being addicted, or who judges them as being less than because they don't have a place to live. They're looking for people who are going to accept them and the situation they're in, and that's important. The third one is safety. Now you'll remember safety was a little lower on the other pyramid. So safety, tents, shelters, places perceived to be safe to sleep, stairwells and on parks, tent cities, all these things we're seeing popping up across the country are part of this safety level of this sort of unhoused version of the pyramid. And places to where it feels safe to do drugs too is another element. If someone's addicted and has that in their life, they're looking for somewhere safe to consume them as much as possible. And then the next one is the physiological piece, or this physiological and psychological. I think, I don't know if that's mislabeled, because in the notes it's different. Anyway, that piece is more of the stage of the pyramid and talking about the idea of moving to a shelter or seeking help. So to get to that level, they need to have all those other things first. And then the last piece is self-actualization, which for many unhoused is literally just surviving. So if you recall from the other pyramid, the self-actualization for some of us is to be the best we can be and achieve amazing things in our lives, whatever that is. For someone who's unhoused, that self-actualization might just be being alive and uninjured, and being able to get by another day. So it's an interesting piece. And what I want to bring up real quick for the group is, if we go back to the original Maslow hierarchy of needs that I've got on the screen here, if we were to threaten somebody's physiological or safety level of this pyramid, so if I threaten to take away somebody's air, or food or drink, that's a threat to their life. That is literally a threat to their existence. And I would expect that any one of us would react quite aggressively to that. If I threaten to take away your air, which you can connote whatever that brings to your mind, you will fight back. You would be very, very concerned. And I would expect a reaction. And we flip to the unhoused triangle here, and we look at the bottom one, esteem. The fundamental for individuals living on the streets who have nothing but themselves is how they see themselves. If I threaten that in an unhoused person by the way I approach them and speak to them, I should expect the same level of aggression that I would get from threatening to take away someone else's food. Like, it's an interesting thing to get our heads around, put ourselves, sort of change our perspective on what an unhoused person is thinking, and realize that if we approach them and threaten what makes them, we should expect a negative response. It'll be very different from what we get from someone else who isn't unhoused. And I think understanding this is interesting. Connie, do you have any thoughts on this? I know you haven't seen this before, but I think we talked about it in the past.
I think it's really interesting just to even in this, make sure that we are defining like maybe our own version or a kind of a collective version of what it means to have esteem, and what esteem looks like is very different as well. Right. So like, you're right. Like, if somebody is funny, maybe that's what they tap into, but how they express that humor might be very different than you would at a cocktail party with your friends, kind of thing. Right. So there's also that difference layered in there as well. And I really, really pick up on like that sense of love and belonging, because I think when we don't have that, and how people end up finding it, especially when they're street involved, and what they do to obtain that would be very different, can be very different from what other people who don't have those complexities or those misfortunes that some of our street involved folks have, right? So again, it's not even that this is flipped around, it's that how we are defining the things that are in each one of those is essential too. Because what, like, my physiological needs in terms of like being able to have a space to do this and food and shelter and that, like, I love camping, but I don't want to live in a tent on the side of a road. But that might be somebody's version of like physiologically that meets their need, would not meet my need. So for me to even like assume that my version of what meets needs or what achieves these things can be a little bit misguided. And one of those reasons to really put ourselves kind of in somebody else's shoes. And to me, a lot of this really brings me down to some of like those biases that we end up having, and how it is really important to remember that, like, as an individual, it's really easy on my worst days to put on this mask and be like, everything is fine, life is good, because I know, where I am going to sleep. I know that I have like people who love me dearly, right? Like, I know all of those things. Pretty confident on a regular basis, I'm not going to be victimized, right? So I know all of those things. So even when something really, really awful happens in my day, I can give or take still have a pretty decent mask on. That mask for people who live all of their private life in public can be very, very difficult. And what pulls off that mask, like your interaction with somebody, can most definitely be the last straw. And it could be the most simple thing of like, hey, would you mind picking that up? That could be the last thing that they can tolerate in that day because didn't get sleep, because they had to sleep on the road, right? Whatever it is that's happening to that individual, most definitely thins that veil that they are able to have. Whereas like people who don't have those misfortunes should be able to, and typically do, have a little bit of a thicker skin around some of those things that could like otherwise poke people, kind of idea. So I think it's important to like recognize that kind of in this hierarchy of needs as well.
No, I like that. I think from what I'm taking from this is that it's important for us to reframe our perception when we're engaging with these folks, to make sure we understand that their perspective on life is different from ours. So things that I would think, well, this isn't going to be a big deal, could be a huge deal to them. And I think that's a valid thing. And there's probably a factor there in what I want to talk about next, which is, I think we'd be remiss not to acknowledge that obviously the homelessness, it seems to be increasing across the country. I've seen some numbers that are suggesting since 2020, like 50 to 60% increases in the number of homeless people. Again, all those different, not strictly homeless, but those like couch surfing, all those things all together. So we're seeing more and more instances where our security professionals across the country, whether it's working for Paladin or working for any other company, are having to engage with these folks because they're in stairwells doing things, because they're building temporary structures where they shouldn't, etc. So the unfortunate thing is, while a lot of those interactions are peaceful, they go off without an incident and everything goes great, every once in a while we have cases where the guard is met with violence, and they unfortunately might be maybe they're too close to the individual when they start the engagement. Maybe it escalates and the distance gets closed. So I guess what I'd be curious about your thoughts on is what advice could you give to security professionals who are being asked to engage and approach with folks like this?
Yeah, well, I think it's first off really important to remember that no matter if we do all of the things that we are told or believe are the right things, things can go sideways on us despite our best preparation. So I think it's really important to recognize that. It's important then to like debrief that incident though too, of like what did go wrong? How could we prepare differently in it too? And what are some of those learnings? But every interaction is going to be different. That's for sure. Like I think there are a couple of those key things that we can pick up on when it does come to dealing with people. I want to say like the first thing is, but there's so many first things. But I think one of the most essential things is we are still dealing with other humans. We are dealing with other humans out in the environment. And I, again, kind of looking at this hierarchy, I also think of like, what are all of the things that has happened in a person's life that has brought them to defecating, to doing drugs, to being sexually assaulted, whatever it is, in a well, or having to feel they need to carry a knife or live in an encampment. Like I try to think of like, what are all of those experiences that this individual has had? So really trying to check like my own bias, my own perception in some of that as well. So I think like some of those things are like, are fundamental to how we go into some of these interactions too. We're dealing with people that have had the whole plethora of experiences that maybe we can't understand. So I typically like to believe in leading with, and to some people I can accept that this sounds a little silly, but like leading with that kind curiosity. Again, why is it that they're in this position that they're in, and being curious about it, and like, what's happening for them today? Why do they feel like they need to be posturing on this corner, acting like a total jerk to everybody that's in this space and intimidating everybody that's in that space? And if you kind of give that a little bit of a thought, you can navigate around it, maybe just a little bit easier. I think like kind of after you do some of those checks, you also have to make sure too that like, you might not be having your best day, but if you go into that interaction in like your worst mood, you're setting the tone for it, right? And I can most definitely appreciate this is now the, umpteenth person that has talked back to you, that has been a jerk to you, that you have seen and had today. But for them, this is their first interaction with you, right? And not wanting you to paint them with the same brush, but vice versa as well. So trying to like be as like grounded in that interaction yourself, so that you can set the tone for it. I always just like to give people as much warning that my presence is coming close to their presence as possible. And I'm imagining that a lot of your folks like have kind of like keep some of that distance. Distance is safety. Like, it's harder to kick somebody when you're across the room than when you're close. It's just the way the world is, right? So keeping some of that distance, but also being mindful of like how you are being, and I'm all over the place, I apologize, but how you're also perceived in this too. So we do have to remember going in as individuals, like in any kind of position of privilege or power, let alone of authority yet too, that we automatically are escalating a situation. Inadvertently, we could be the happiest, friendliest, nicest people, but we're automatically escalating it. So sometimes it's about what we can do to not escalate things rather than even thinking about some of that like de-escalation or whatever. But like I said, I usually think about like, what's my approach? What could this person be thinking about me as well? Again, especially if I'm in that position of power. And then giving them space, giving them warning. And then I think there's like a couple of other things that like happen along the way of like, how can you best personalize this interaction? Like, hey, like, how's it going? I see that you're coloring, like, and sounds really silly. I get it. But making maybe some of that personal connection of like, oh, I see your shoes, or like, those are great shoes, or like, oh, you don't have shoes. I'm really sorry to see that. Like, but I have to ask you to go, right? I can give you 5 minutes, but I still have to get you to go. Right. So sometimes there might be some of that negotiation along the way that ends.
Makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
I think it's about giving that person the opportunity to have some decision making. It might be within like the narrow confines that you provide them, but at least some decision making. It may be like crappy option A to them, crappy option B to them, but it's still at least an option that they're able to choose. And it might be 5 minutes versus 4 minutes. But it's still, again, an option that they can choose, which then gives them some of that autonomy and some power over what's happening in that situation too.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's something I sort of preach in all security interactions. As much as possible, give the person you're engaged with the perception they have the choice to do what they want to do, sort of the way out of the situation. So like you say, negotiating in terms of like, listen, if you could, we'll give you 5 minutes to pack up your stuff and go. Thanks so much. Being polite, all those things, and not being too aggressive. Because one thing I think is important for us to remember when we're engaging with marginalized folks, any of the people we've talked about so far, is you don't know if last week someone in a uniform was very aggressive with them, very rude, maybe even assaulted them. We just don't know if so. We don't know what their relationship with the security uniform is, or the police uniform, or any sort of uniform of authority. So we're walking in. Most of us are uniformed. We're kind of already in that uniform. So we need to be aware that this person could have a bad taste in their mouth. Has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with someone they dealt with, weeks before, or days before, or hours before. And another thing you mentioned that I really like is, often it's easy for us in the security industry. We might ask 50 people a day to leave. And I'm sure there's people on the call who could tell me, no, it's more like 500 people a day, or some sites where it's much slower. It's like, oh, I only do it once a day. But if you do, say, 50 times have to say to somebody it's time to go, or maybe not the same person, 50 different people you have to tell them, you have to remember that it's the first time they're hearing that from you. So we can't let our frustration at the fact that we've had to repeat this same message 50 times affect our delivery. We have to remember that this might be the first time this person's the first time we've engaged with them. We need to remember that we have to treat them with the same compassion we did with the first time we asked somebody to leave earlier that day, or the first time in our career. It can be challenging. I'll admit that. I've been doing this job for almost 30 years, and it can be easy to slip into that sort of, oh, geez, I got to repeat this message again. But we need to be mindful that it's the first time some people have heard it. And there's another thing I want to talk about. We're at about the 35-minute mark. We got about 10 more minutes before we'll look at some of the questions that are coming in. And I do see there are some questions and some comments. I will get to them. So we've talked a little bit about the best approach. We're already at a bit of a, well, I don't want to say it's a disadvantage that we're in the uniform, but we need to be mindful of the perception or the image we present as we walk up, especially like some of us are equipped with vests, like ballistic or stab vests. We will look quite officious, folks. And some of us, depending on your build and your stature, you could be a pretty intimidating character. So you're walking up on somebody. I liked what Connie said about giving them as much notice as possible that you're approaching, so that you're not scaring somebody and having them react in fear of this big, potentially a big imposing security person looming over them suddenly. One of the other things I want to talk about briefly is, I am aware in our industry we need to be safety focused. And I'm also aware that in some cases, some of these unhoused people, maybe they have drug paraphernalia with them. Maybe they have materials with them that we don't necessarily want to touch with our bare hands. And this is one of my pet peeves that I'm just going to broach to the whole group. We need to be mindful of what it looks like to people when we glove up. I think most of us have heard this term before. Most of us are equipped with Kevlar gloves or some form of frisk glove that we carry. If you are attending a situation where you think you need your gloves, my advice to you is to put the gloves on well before you get there. And the reason I say that is because if you've never had a chance, see if you can get a chance to watch video of security putting on their gloves in the moment. It is akin to boxers lacing up their boxing gloves. I've seen so many instances of this where security starts to converge on a situation. They recognize that they're going to want their gloves. They start putting their gloves on, and that gloving up action actually comes across as a bit aggressive. And from the perspective of someone we're dealing with, or perhaps who is being circled now by maybe 2 or 3 security professionals, that can be quite intimidating and scary. So just be mindful of that. I am putting on your gloves before you get there, so they're already on, is way better than gloving up right in front of a person. Now, we obviously can't always do that, but just be mindful of what gloving up looks like. It can come across as being quite confrontational, and I think it's something we can be mindful of. It might help improve some of our interactions, especially if we're able to get those gloves on sooner. Does that resonate with you as well, Connie?
It absolutely does. And as a civilian that's worked alongside police for 16-ish years, like I have always known when things are going sideways is when somebody's putting on their gloves. right? That is like the turning point of like, that's when I go back into the car and wait in the car while things
Yeah.
are happening, because I'm not equipped to be able to deal with whatever it is that's happening, kind of idea. But I think, James, you also mentioned a really important point when it comes to there has to be a balance. And again, there's never one answer, but there has to be a balance between the number of individuals that are involved in a situation. Because if it's you and 4 of your colleagues, your security colleagues surrounding, and when I say surrounding, I don't mean that you're like hunching over, but even like in that proximity, that in of itself can feel really intimidating. And sometimes some of the things that we can do can inadvertently escalate situations. And I think like the gloving up is most definitely one of them. I think like having all of these people standing around, even watching what's happening, because sometimes that then's going to get on your esteem level of needs as well, right? So now, like with all of these people, they all think I'm awful, right? So sometimes even just those types of things are really important to be mindful of how many people absolutely need to be involved, how many people need to be close, and how many people can be like at a distance, just kind of watching or listening on the radio to see what's happening, if kind of equipped with those things. So I think it's really important, again, and that comes down to that perception of how like in uniform we're perceived. And even as a city, a while ago, we had done a survey between individuals and our unhoused folks, their ability to, like, they could recognize it if they saw it side by side, but like the desire to acknowledge the difference between a police member, a community peace officer, a transit peace officer, and a security guard, like they see uniform. They don't see whether it's got a stripe or a crest or a this or a that. So they're really painting with that same brush. For anybody. So it's not even just the crappy interaction that somebody's had with you or one of your colleagues. It's all of the interactions that they've had with anybody that's kind of in that type of position of authority from birth. Because I think of the number of individuals who are street involved who have probably had a parent or a caregiver taken away by an enforcement individual, right? So now that even taints every interaction that they've had, right? So even
that makes sense.
Those things into consideration as well, and how we're kind of like showing up for people, right?
No, that makes absolute sense to me, and I think we also should be mindful. Example, in Vancouver recently, a temporary tent city structure was set up along Hastings Street, I think, in the downtown east side, and it stayed there for several months, and it grew and it developed into a bit of a community. Obviously not ideal for the business owners and people that were moving through that area. And eventually the police rolled in with police officers, city officials, and garbage trucks. And they basically tore down the encampment. Like they tore the tents up. They gave them warning. But when they were still there at the deadline, they went through and basically pretty aggressively removed everything they didn't want there anymore. And it's an interesting thought to be mindful that, so I'm reading that in the news, the person I'm dealing with 4 hours later might be someone who just had all their belongings thrown away by someone in a uniform. And now I'm in a uniform and all I want to do is ask them to move along. But it's like, again, another one of these guys in a uniform coming and ruining my life from their perspective. And maybe they react aggressively. Connie, so admittedly to the group, Connie and I have chatted a little bit in advance about this topic. One of the things that you had in your notes to me, we talked about safety considerations, because a big part of this to me is keeping our employees safe as well. They're being asked to engage with people. And we talked about how many homeless people do carry weapons. Unfortunately, sometimes they do deploy those weapons on our security personnel when we're engaged with them. So you shared some thoughts with me on best practices from your perspective around for the uniformed personnel. You mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I will. And I did just want to put it out there and say that like I do recognize we're actually asking like folks, security personnel, to do a lot. We're asking you to put away your worst day that's happening, to put away the 50 interactions that you've had before this, right? Like we're asking you to do reversals that you may not have signed up to be doing. We're asking all of these things. Totally get how like that feels really heavy. It feels like there's so much onus on you. That onus is being placed on you ultimately for your safety, right? Is really what it comes down to. It's usually like that's typically the way I think about some of that onus. And it's stuff that I talk about with like regular citizens too. Like, I'm sorry that I'm asking you to walk on a different side of the street because this side of the street feels unsafe or uncomfortable. That's a crappy thing to have to tell Edmontonians. But like, avoiding the risk is far better than encountering and encroaching it, unless you kind of like absolutely have to. So like, wanting to recognize, like I said, that it is very heavy to be asking what we're asking of folks. I get that. But when it comes to some of those things, when it's like that best practice of keeping safe, I always think of like, leading in again, like I said, with like that kind curiosity, and quite often being like not as disarming as possible, whatever that looks like for you. So it might be like being a little bit friendly. It might be being like drippingly friendly and overly friendly. Sometimes it might be being apologetic. So it's like, I'm really sorry, got to get you to do this. Kind of going back a little bit to the gloving up kind of thought. I usually think like, I don't like it when I can't see where somebody's hands are, because where do people put weapons and things I don't want them to use against me is in pockets or behind their back. So if we can't see your hands, they're probably feeling a little bit more vulnerable as well. So that could even be something that's like going to potentially escalate things. So it's some of that space. It's some of that like being apologetic, being as respectful as possible of like, I'm really sorry. This is just like what we have to do today. But then over the course of that interaction, being very, very mindful of what it looks like from their angle in terms of like, have their behaviors changed, right? So it like, they might just be talking to all of the people that don't exist in your world, right? But if suddenly they start fixating and only talking to one of the 7 people, that's when you start to kind of like notice that there's a change in behavior, that maybe things are going in a different direction. Thinking about what tension in your body and anger and frustration looks like in your body, and noticing those types of things in other people. So are you like suddenly like noticing that they're wringing their hands, or that maybe they're rubbing their neck because that's like their center of like anger for them, or where they start to get hot about things. So noticing those types of things. Again, if they start to like go really random off topic, starting to talk louder or starting to talk a whole lot quieter because maybe they're trying to bring you in close, noticing it's like ultimately around that change of behavior. I do with that always want to give the caveat of like, we have folks out there that are neurodiverse, like just everyday folks that are neurodiverse, who can also display a lot of these behaviors. So like thinking about people that like I know with like that are on the spectrum with autism and wringing hands or rubbing their head. I just said those same things, but they're on the spectrum, and they're not being aggressive. And that's part of that reason for that curiosity to bring that in of like, what is actually happening here? Is it escalating, or is there something else that might be happening along the way that I need to be mindful of instead? So it can be asking some of those questions, trying to find out a little bit more about what's happening for them. So
that's a fantastic point. And I think there's a story I'll just briefly mention because it fits in with what you just talked about. Years and years ago, there was an incident where a person was perceived as being intoxicated in a building. All their body language, everything, it appeared that they were under the influence of something, and so security converged to remove this intoxicated person from the space. Not recognizing that their movements and their way of moving and the way their body was behaving was actually because of multiple sclerosis. So they mistook the symptoms of MS for intoxication, which can happen. There can be slurred speech. There can be movement challenges with that type of medical condition. So it's interesting to keep our minds open to that. I think we need to keep safety at the forefront. But I think we need to try to really recognize and watch carefully to determine if what we're seeing is neurodiversity, like Connie was talking about, or whether it is in fact aggressive behavior. But hopefully, we're keeping a safe distance. I'm gonna stop there, and I want to tell one more quick story, and then I'm going to go to the questions. And the story I want to tell is. We as security professionals can actually have a positive impact on people every day in different ways. It can be as simple as opening a door for a customer or saying hello to somebody in the morning, give a smile, wave, engaging with someone. It can make their day. And even with the folks we're talking about today, we have a story that I want to share. One of our guards in Western Canada, he sort of over time had created a rapport with a young, unhoused and addicted male. The young man kept coming back to the property, And so the security supervisor had to engage. He had to talk to him at different times, ask him to move along, ask him to pack up and move. But he created a relationship with this guy by treating him as a human, treating him with respect, and treating him kindly. And one day the young man was being asked to move on, and he told the security supervisor that he was thinking of like ending his life. He was really thinking that life wasn't worth living anymore. So the supervisor talked to him and said, listen, I want you to come back every day. Come back every day and see me so I can check on you and I know you're okay. So every day for like 2-3 weeks, this kid kept coming back, and the supervisor would engage with him and have a nice little chat with him, make sure he was okay, and then he'd go on his way. And this I think really it's the human is humanizing that the supervisor, the respect he showed him and the time he gave him. The next thing we knew, the kid came and said he wanted to get into a rehab clinic and didn't know what to do. So the supervisor engaged with local resources and found a rehab place for this kid. And he went and is, from what I understand, has a job and is on a more productive path now. And his mother came to the property to thank the supervisor. So I'm not saying that we can achieve that level of amazing every day, but just be aware, like we do have an interesting opportunity to make people's lives better, even in a small way and sometimes in a huge way. So I'm going to go to some of the questions here. One of the first ones was, when approaching an unhoused person, you need to ask to move along. Would it be worthwhile considering adding ununiformed people for the first approach? It might be, but there's some legalities around uniforming in Canada, and in each province is different when and how you can be out of uniform in a security capacity. But it's an interesting thought that if you did have an environment that, in my opinion, if you had an environment that was having a really serious challenge with unhoused people congregating, setting things up, like it was becoming unmanageable, maybe an ununiformed approach using a different support agency. An example of this is in Edmonton, one of our properties is having some challenges, and we connected them with one of Connie's colleagues who could help sort of find ways to approach the challenge. But I think anytime, what is my cat doing? Anytime we talk about getting out of uniform, we need to be mindful of the legislation in our environment. And to see if we got any good others here. One of my colleagues, security colleagues from Montreal, posted something. We have access to diverse equipment and technology to prevent or discourage homeless people from finding shelter in spaces. I think he's okay. I see what he's saying. It's no longer simple. That's his point, and I agree with him. It's no longer a simple issue of continually kicking people out. We almost need to include social worker level training for security officers. I really like that suggestion. And I think the conversation we're having today is a bit akin to that. Obviously, we're not walking out of here as social workers now, but I think we need to have that mindset when we're working with folks and being ready to have resources. Example, what I recommend to properties that have struggles with unhoused people is, rather than just continually kicking them out, have all of the frontline staff equipped with information on where the nearest shelter is, where's the nearest food bank, where can a person get a warm meal for free, where could they sleep tonight in the cold, especially in the cold months. There are obviously cities in Canada that are much less forgiving than others. It's much easier, I would imagine, to be homeless in Vancouver than it is to be homeless in Edmonton or Calgary or Winnipeg, where in the winter we're talking about minus 40 degrees. I can't even imagine. I honestly cannot imagine it. So I think I like that thought of thinking of ourselves a little bit as social workers when we're engaging with folks.
And it might be like, James, just to pick up on that, like it might just be, like you said, like knowing where those closest things are, or maybe a good agency to be able to call. And like, at least in Edmonton, we have like collaborative groups that are constantly sitting around and navigating this and making sure that like our people on the front line have those resources and are aware of those resources, because we know how essential it is. And we know that quite often it's our security personnel or our enforcement personnel that are that first line of contact. And like, don't want you to have to be social workers. At least know who to call, who is the social that can go in. And we in Edmonton have a couple of different partnerships that are like enforcement and outreach based, just kind of like for that purpose. But like, I think that's really, really great, is like making sure that you just know where those closest types of things are.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I like that. We one more question from Jamie Johnson. He says part of his role is to make recommendations and evaluations on different security programs. He's asking, which vertical or portion of the security industry do you see having the most conflict, and what's the best way to rebrand those interactions? I'll take this first, and then Connie, if you have any thoughts. The thing that jumped into my head here, Jamie, is I think right now, in terms of unhoused people, any property is essentially going to have challenges depending on where they're located. Obviously, a rural environment or critical infrastructure will probably have less of a challenge with unhoused than, say, a commercial property or a retail shopping center, more in the urbanized space. But one thing I want to touch on here, you talk about rebranding those interactions. I'm a huge proponent of addressing behavior as opposed to addressing people. So what I mean by that is, if a person starts loitering in a property, I want to address the loitering, but I don't necessarily need to address the person immediately. I can say to them essentially, hey, loitering isn't allowed. If you stop loitering, we don't have a problem. Now, if over time they demonstrate they can't disassociate themselves from that unwanted activity, then I think we need to start addressing the person. But I think one way to rebrand, you should talk about rebranding those interactions, is to make sure we're addressing the activity rather than the individual. So we're showing the person respect. We're showing the person that they are a member of the community, but we're addressing the behavior that is problematic for the environment. And I think that's a huge part of addressing this challenge correctly, is to make sure we're not discriminating against people, we're maintaining their human rights, we're being respectful of all those things. We're just addressing their behavior the way we would with anyone else whose behavior doesn't fit in the environment. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I hope it does. I'd love to talk to you more about it at length, maybe on another call if you're interested in connecting. Connie, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think that's like really a beautiful answer, is because like it is about what those behaviors are as opposed to the human. Because I think especially for some of our marginalized folks, and we see it in our just general society with people becoming more and more polarized, we've dehumanized the other so very much. So the more we can humanize and just look at behaviors, it doesn't matter who is participating in those behaviors. It's just the behavior itself that's unacceptable, as opposed to the human that is unacceptable. So I think it's really, really important to focus on that. So I appreciate that as kind of like the approach and the thought process.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going through the chat now, and Jamie, same guy who asked that previous question, he made a good comment about the question about non-uniformed. Like, should we have non-uniform personnel? He agreed with me about the provincial challenges of that. But the other thing is, we need to remember the uniform does come with a certain amount of authority as an agent of the property. And that's an interesting thing, because I could see the non-uniform backfiring in terms of the person you're asking to leave saying, well, who are you? Who are you to ask me to leave here? And then you have to explain your authority to actually ask them to leave, which could create another form of conflict. So I think that's a valid thing. I think there's pros and cons to the uniform in this case. But without it, I have seen interactions with non-uniformed people go very poorly because the person they're engaged with assumes they're just someone from the public and they can mind their own business, and it's going to go badly from there. So I see there's been some good conversation going on in the chat. And I'm not going to read all of it. There's a lot of positive things, but some questions here. How many officers should attend when dealing with the unhoused? I think we kind of covered that. It's a great question. I'm of the mind that we would engage the person one-on-one, just like you would in any other human-to-human interaction. But maybe if you need backup, maybe they're just out of the way a little bit, close enough that they can respond if things go sideways, but not so close that they escalate the situation. And I'd also be mindful. I know tactically it makes sense, but there's nothing more disconcerting than having people surround you. So if I'm talking to someone in front of me and their partner goes behind me, that's incredibly disconcerting, and it can make me feel very unsafe, which might make me react in a negative way. And then when should gloves be put on when attending an individual? Personally, if I'm a security officer and I get a call saying there is a person loitering on the north sidewalk, I would probably put my gloves on well before I got to the north sidewalk. So they're already on. I don't have to do that gloving up thing right in front of the person of interest or the subject, the person we're engaging with. And they're already on. So I'm protected, I'm safe, but I don't have to do that aggressive thing in front. And then the last question from this same person, what distance would be safe? And then because you don't know if they're concealing bear or pepper spray. That's 100% true. We don't know if they're concealing those things. I'm of the mind that you want to be far enough away that the other person, and this goes for any interaction, folks. This has nothing to do with just unhoused people. This is any interaction, because we're seeing more and more violence since COVID. There's whole reasons for it. We don't need to get into post pandemic rage and all these other concepts. You can Google that if you like. But a safe distance to me is one where I can't be reached or kicked or punched, where they would have to take at least a step towards me to make physical contact, but not so far away that I have to yell. You want to find the perfect balance. And I think I've talked about this in other contexts, but you don't want to be yelling at the person, but you also don't want to use too quiet of a voice. And why that is because if I speak very quietly, it forces the person to lean in to hear me. So I'm forcing them to get closer to me to hear what I'm saying. So I want to use enough voice that they can hear me comfortably without having to get closer. But that is not aggressive, certainly not yelling. Now, okay, we've just hit the 12 o'clock mark, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. But I want to thank everybody who joined today's session. And thank you, Connie, for joining us today to talk about this important topic. If any of you want to engage further, I'm sure you'll find a way to reach me. Happy to speak with anybody further about this topic. I think it's a timely one. I think it's a challenging one for a lot of folks, and I think it's important for us as an industry to address this with empathy front of mind. I think treating people with respect, as Connie was talking about, I think is huge. And I think if we can all adopt that, I think everyone will benefit for it. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. Thank you again, Connie, for joining me in this conversation. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for tuning in with the Difference Makers. If you want to hear more about the ins and outs of the security industry from real professionals, be sure to subscribe, rate, review, and share. Also, check out new episodes on the first Tuesday of every month. Till next time.